We continue in Luke 23 today as Pilate is turning Jesus over to the will of the people. And I want to highlight that from the previous verse. I can just scroll back up so we can see the end of that. It's not that he hands them over to the quote-unquote Jews, or if we prefer the Judeans, handed over, as we saw last time, to their will. So the Romans will now do the will of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, or whatever combination of the chief priests and their companions that we've been seeing throughout chapters 22 and 23 in Luke's Gospel. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, now we're in this section from 23:26 to 49. Today we're just going to look through verse 31 and beginning of 32, and then we'll continue in this section. And as we do, one of the things I want to note, as we have been noting throughout this sequence, is how different Luke's is. To even call this synoptic is really misleading, because you can see the parts that are bold are the parts that are unique to each of the evangelists. And although Matthew follows Mark fairly closely here, and in the parts that are not bold here are the parts they have in common, and although he's made some changes for his own style, Luke leaves almost nothing from Mark. All he has is they led him away, and Simon of Cyrene, and you can see the green here taken directly from Mark, was coming in from the country. For whatever reason, Matthew left that out. So we certainly see that Luke knows Mark's section here, as we've seen throughout the journey to Jerusalem, how closely he followed Mark in many ways. And yet, through this period of Jesus going to the cross and out the other side through resurrection, we can see that Luke's stories is different from Mark and Matthew's, as in many ways John's is. So we're going to have to look at all these details here. And as we do, another aspect of Luke's that is unique is how he shaped this section here from 26 to 49 as this one large chiasm. And you can see that the A part that we're going to look at today and the A prime part that you can see down here are both characterized by a man and a group of women. So Simon of Cyrene and the daughters of Jerusalem on the way to the cross, and afterward the Roman centurion and the women who had followed him from Galilee. So Jerusalem women and Galilean women here, and here a man from the country and a centurion as the parallel. In the B parts that we'll get to, we see here in each of in the B part and the B prime part here, in each of them, Jesus offers a prayer to God in terms of Father, and in both situations there's some kind of tearing of material, the casting of lots to divide his clothing, and the tearing of the curtain in two, although different language is used there. But as when we get there, we'll see the analogies there to Jesus' clothing and the curtain of the temple that makes that part of the chiasm. And the center is the part unique to Luke, is the conversation between Jesus and the two people on the crosses next to him, and only Luke has that. So really we're looking at a uniquely Lucan perspective here, and we'll begin that in verse 26, as we can see on the left side of the screen. So as they led him away, they seized a man. And since the Simon of Cyrene part is the only part that's in common, let's at least look at how those are different here. In Mark and Matthew, that only happens after the Roman soldiers have done their part in mocking Jesus, but we don't see that in Luke. We already saw Jesus being mocked by others, including Herod's soldiers, but we did not see mocking in the last scene with Pilate. And so what we also don't see in Luke, as I noted earlier, is the putting him in the equivalent of a royal robe, in Mark a purple cloak, and Matthew a scarlet robe, and we don't see the soldiers mocking him by saying King of the Judeans, as we see in both of those, nor stripping him. Nor do we see the crown of thorns, nor do we see him stripping of the purple cloak or red scarlet one and putting his clothes back on. So all of this is left out. Luke jumps right into the situation with Simon, and let's look at the difference there. In Mark, the original, we said they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry the cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, whoever they were. Matthew changes it to, as they went out, they came upon a man. So notice here they found a passerby and compelled him, but here they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And then Luke just simply says they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. So the laying the cross on him is unique there, but they all have carrying it in one form or another. Matthew had simply carry his cross. Luke had similarly carry his cross. I suppose I should not have those in bold since those are common to both. I'll fix that before I post it at radicalbible.net. And yet Luke has, they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus, which is almost like discipleship, but we'll look at that in just a moment. One of the questions for all of these is, who is Simon of Cyrene, and why do we need to know this detail? And why is that detail there? Why him? Why have anybody carry the cross? Why not just let Jesus carry his own cross? Is there some tradition of impelling somebody else to do it? We know nothing about that from Roman sources, and there's nothing else in the New Testament to suggest that. We will talk more about crucifixion next time when Jesus is on the cross, but it's certainly a uniquely Roman form of punishment and would have been understood that by everybody, especially by Luke's Roman audience. So they would know, one would think, although would they, about a tradition of getting somebody from the local countryside to help? And I ask would they, because how many Romans have ever experienced a crucifixion any more than how many U.S. Americans where I live have experienced capital punishment by the state? It's not something that most people experience in their daily life. And other than in places like Jerusalem, where most Romans obviously didn't live, they wouldn't have even been in an environment where such a situation would arise. So we don't know anything about the tradition, and we don't know anything about why this particular person is named or why he is chosen. In Luke, he's one of several Simons. Simon Peter, as we've looked at, and Jesus called him Simon when he predicted that he would deny him. But we also had Simon the Pharisee in chapter 7 in Luke, where the woman from the city came and anointed Jesus' feet with her tears and with the perfume. And so several Simons, but Cyrene, which is otherwise not a biblical place, we can see from the atlas here that is not something Paul went to, but this map at least shows it in what's current-day Libya here in Cyrenaica. And so he's lives all the way there, or at least he's from there. We don't know if he's still living there or if that's just his ancestry. We really know nothing about him except this one line. But Cyrene is way over there. It doesn't seem to have any specific symbolic value for any of the gospel writers. One can imagine things, but there's no basis for any other than pure speculation. It says he's coming in from the country, so it's suggesting he's approaching Jerusalem for the feast from the countryside. Is he a Jew? We would assume so, but we don't know that. Although there are, archaeologically and otherwise, we know there was a Jewish community in Cyrene. But anything else is just pure speculation. So returning to our story and away from the map, since that's all it can tell us. And they laid the cross on him. And we've seen the cross earlier in two places only for what disciples should do. So we see back in 9:23, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross daily and follow me. And then we see in 14:27, whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. So we heard it twice about discipleship. Strangely, perhaps, this is the first time we're hearing the cross mentioned around the question of Jesus. We heard, of course, in the last scene, the call to crucify him, but it's a different word there. So this is the first time we're hearing the cross, and it's laid on Simon, not on Jesus. It made him carry it behind Jesus, using the word oposthen here, only one other time, the women behind Jesus in 844. Worth going back to see the parallel there. The woman with the flow of blood who came up behind Jesus and touched him, and then he tells her, your faith has saved you. And so is Simon of Cyrene potentially a person of faith? Well, there's no reason to know that, and we don't know anything more about him. But in addition to him carrying the cross, we hear this. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were, the New RSV has, beating their breasts and wailing for him, but we need to look more closely at the language there. As Green notes below, indicating how short-lived was the solidarity of the Jewish people with their Jerusalem leaders in opposition to Jesus. Because we'd seen in the previous scene, it said the chief priests and the people, didn't say all the people, but it said the people, and then all of those called out, crucify him. And yet plainly it wasn't all the Jerusalemites. And we know that because there's plainly followers of Jesus who are in Jerusalem, although they're not Jerusalemites, they're Galileans. We don't know about these people. We don't know how far they followed him from, if they're local people, or if there's some of the people who followed him all the way from Galilee, but that's not named. The phrase for a great number here, poloplephos, is the fullness of the people, which echoes ironically the fullness of the opposition we saw in 23:1 when they rose as a group in their fullness to turn Jesus over to Pilate. So here is the discipleship word, though, akoleitheo, and we see how many times it's used here, and this is the last time. So are these disciples? Well, they're following Jesus, so one can assume that, although we don't know what happened to those other than those who are named here. Among them were women. The term for beating their breast here, koptonta, using the root word kopto, which normally means to beat or to cut, as my note below has. That's what it is in 852. It's translated as wail in Revelation 1:17 and 18:9, and never in the New Testament is it translated as beating the breast, although such a rendering is possible according to the Liddell Scott lexicon. It's used 90 times in the Septuagint, and only one example that I can see suggests that it would be beating the breast, and that's the Isaiah passage there. But down farther in verse 48, we'll hear a different phrase used for beating the breast, which is actually that phrase. As you can see there, tuptantis ta stethe. It's hard to say for a moment there. And so it's suggesting that it doesn't mean beating the breast, and Jesus' response here is about do not weep. And so it says, the other word that the narrator says that they were wailing for him, using this term here, ethrenun here. So we could easily translate this as weeping and wailing, although the term here can be translated directly as wail. But perhaps then it's a hendiadys, these together, although I don't know of other situations of those together to suggest it would be a standard hendiadys, which if you're not familiar with the technical literary term hendiadys, it means two words put together with a noun that's suggesting one action that they're put together for. Whether it's beating their breast or weeping and wailing, it doesn't matter ultimately, but it's a linguistic issue there about what's going on. I'd suggest it's weeping and wailing in response to what Jesus says in response here. So Jesus turned to them, much as he turned to see Simon Peter in the high priest's courtyard earlier. So he turned to them and addresses them this way. Daughters of Jerusalem. Some suggest the analogy with Song of Songs, but I'd suggest that's not comparison here. The Song of Songs is really not what's at issue. The term Daughters of Jerusalem can mean, as it certainly suggests here, specific women, the women of Jerusalem. It interestingly can also be used for daughter cities, what we would refer to as suburbs, cities in relation to that. So we'd see that, for example, in texts like Ezekiel, where it refers to Judea's, Jerusalem's daughter cities and Samaria's daughter cities. But here it's certainly the people, the women of Jerusalem. And he says to them in a couple of key verses we need to look at closely. Do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. So immediately what we're hearing is the focus is not on Jesus and his fate, but on the fate of Jerusalem. And that's going to be key to the interpretation of verse 31, which is tricky to do. So I'm trying to set that up here for us. So weep for yourselves and for your children. And here's why, as we hear. And what we hear in verse 29 reverses the joy of the Annunciation we heard in 115 and of the visitation in 141 and 45 to 45, but recalling 21-23 as I'll show in a moment. For the days are surely coming, which is to say, omitting an edu there, behold, so we could say, behold, the days are coming when they will say. And one of the issues that we have to face here in interpreting this in 31 is there's 3 theys in 3 verses. They will say this, they will begin to say this, and they will do this. So we'll have to consider, are there 3 theys, 2 theys, or all the same they? So they will say, blessed are the barren, Makarios here, using it ironically, of course, the final occasion of it. Blessed are the barren, who is Elizabeth there before she was with child, with John the Baptist, of course. And the wombs that had never bore, using kolios there, as we again analogizing from the beginning, as I've been noting throughout this unit here, there are many echoes of the early chapters 1, 2, and 3 in Luke, and so we certainly see that here. That never bore, and the breast that never nursed. Here using mastoi for breast, which was not what's used up here. So let's go back to see the flip side of this, the 2 elements of this. So back in 1127 here was the woman in the crowd who said, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you. And he said, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it. But here's something more specific is being recalled that helps us to interpret verse 31, and that's Jesus saying this in the apocalyptic discourse, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress in the earth and wrath against these people. And as we looked at in chapter 21, plainly that's about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. And notice that what's being said here is the exact same thing as what we hear in our immediate passage, except in reverse language. So woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing, in contrast to blessed are those who are not pregnant and those who are not nursing. So we see the parallel there. So we can certainly expect that the interpretation here is that Jesus is, or Luke, using this in Jesus, is redirecting them from wailing about the fate of Jesus to the fate of Jerusalem, which is the bigger picture here. And so that's the focus here. So who could be the they that will say this? Blessed are the barren. Well, it certainly seems like it would be those who are witnessing the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. So this is not about Jesus' crucifixion here. It's about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem based on what we heard analogized from chapter 21. So they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, so they don't have to face the horror of Roman destruction while they're pregnant and while they're nursing. But is this the same they? Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. So we have to look a little more closely at that. This is a direct quote from Hosea 10:8. Let's look back at that. We can hear, they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and the hills, fall on us. But in the immediate context of Hosea, those who are saying that are Samaria's king. So it's calling upon God's judgment upon those, this Samaria being the successors of Israel, that they'll face the the Assyrian exile. And this is expressing the judgment on Samaria by a foreign nation. So similarly here, expressing the judgment on Jerusalem by the Romans, we could hear that those who begin to say this are those who are the elite of Jerusalem, who are going to be victims of the Romans. We can also note it's parallel to how it's used in Revelation 6:16. And although we can't methodologically assume that Luke knows about Revelation, it certainly suggests the question of whether New Testament interpreters, both quoting Hosea 10:8, were doing it from the same perspective. So here we see the verse in Revelation, and in the previous verse we can hear that those who are calling to the mountains and rocks are the elite, the kings of the earth, the magnates, the generals, and the rich and the powerful, but then everybody who's dependent upon empire in John of Patmos's vision, apocalyptic vision. And so it certainly makes sense whether we see it from Hosea's immediate comparison of Samaria to John of Patmos's comparison with the Romans and the elites of empire, that this is those, whether it's the elites or everybody in Jerusalem, who will see that contrary to what Jesus said in the apocalyptic discourse, that when you see these things happen, you should run. It's now too late to run, and all they can do is hide. And so to suggest that the earth here, the mountains, would collaborate with them and fall on us, of course, mountains falling on you and the hills covering you would not protect you, it would destroy you. But perhaps it's an expression of the desperation. You'd rather die that way than be taken captive or raped or otherwise face into the horrors of Roman actions there. So here the cover is calypto, which is, my note below suggests, an anti-apocalypse, because apocalypto is the root of apocalypse, to lift the veil. So this is to cover this. And perhaps it also is implying cover it in the anti-apocalyptic sense of we don't want to know. But that may be reading it too far. So then we get to this verse, for if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it was dry? And to help us understand this verse, I brought up this little chart of interpretive issues here, because there are translation issues and then there are other issues. So let's just go through these quickly. I've already suggested the question of this, of who is the they and how are they related to the they that we just saw in verse 29 and verse 30. Because here, if they do this when the wood is dry, whoever the they is doing this can't be the same as those who are ironically calling a blessing upon those who are not pregnant or not nursing, or those who want to be hidden from what's happening. These are plenty of the people perceive or are the victims of what this they will do. But the question is, what is it they will do? And so that's what we have to look at. And one of the grammatical issues here that we have to look at is, in the New RSV, it sounds like there's one wood that's being transformed. If they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? But that's only one way to translate this. So first, let's note that the word for green here is not green at all. It's hugro, which means moist. Why not just say moist so the analogy is more clear between moist and dry? But that's not what these translators did. And that word hugro is only here in the New Testament. And so this phrase here, what will happen, literally, as you can see below, means in the dry, what happens? But it's not clear whether that's the same wood or not. So it can be read either way. So certainly, if we read this the way some have, and you can see this from number 4 here on the right side, as two kinds of wood, and the traditional interpretation, which is openly anti-Jewish, is that the moist refers to Jesus' crucifixion, and the dry is the destruction of the quote-unquote Jews, or at least of the Jerusalem Jews. Then we have to see that as two different woods and not something that changed, because plainly, if the moist is Jesus, if what they do is the crucifixion and Jesus is the moist wood, the living wood, if you want to put it that way, then Jesus doesn't become dry wood there. The other way to read that is that the moist is Jesus' crucifixion, but the dry is the Roman destruction of Jerusalem rather than of the Jews or the Jerusalem Jews. But still, that requires it being two different woods, and that's one way to read it. Another way is that it's about Jerusalem, and that's what I want to suggest, that Jesus made clear here that this is not about him. This is about Jerusalem. And so if we get it away from the idea that the wood is Jesus, then we can hear it perhaps that the moist is the living Jerusalem now, which is in Jesus' time within the story, and the dry is after Jerusalem is destroyed and Roman control is total. So that's one possibility. Another one parallel to that is the moist is Jerusalem with Jesus in it, suggesting that it's moist because of Jesus' living presence, and the dry is Jerusalem after Jesus' death. Either way, on the C and D's, the comparison is between what can happen to Jerusalem or to the people of God when the city is still alive or when Jesus is in it, and what will happen after. But it's certainly suggesting, and I'm not suggesting there's a right answer to this or that we can get to the a clear conclusion on it, that it's plainly about a contrast between a condition now where bad things are happening and what it'll be worse later. Some have suggested, because of the green and dry, that it's about a fire starting, and the issue is that you can't hard to start a fire with green wood, and if they're willing to do that, you can imagine what a conflagration would be when it's dry, and that would bring up comparisons with the winnowing fan of John the Baptist and God's fire of judgment, and that's a possibility too. But I'd like to suggest that in an image like this, we're not going to get to an answer, and that's probably the closest we can do to get to one. And so it ends with another uniquely Lucan element. Two others also who were criminals or evildoers, and we'll look at that next time, were led away to be put to death with him. And we'll see the crucifixion scene unique to Luke next time. See you then. Bye-bye.